Good afternoon, and welcome to the EMA's 25th Anniversary Knowledge Series. As part of this series, we've been having a number of webinars, and these webinars have allowed us to share more information on the role and responsibilities of the EMA. So our last webinar dealt with the Certificate of Environmental Clearance rules. And today we are happy to bring to you a session that provides more information on the EMA's permit monitoring process. What happens next after a permit has been issued? And as you know, the EMA is a regulatory agency and permitting is part of that function. So we're pleased to bring you this 5th installment of the webinar series. Today, our session is also going to be streamed live on Facebook. So welcome to both our Zoom and our Facebook Live participants. It will also be recorded, and this will be placed on the EMA's YouTube channel, which can be easily accessed via the EMA's website at ema.co.tt. And just to give you an idea of the format of today's session, we will begin with the presentation, and this will be followed by a discussion segment. All questions we are asking that they are posted in the chat box only. And so with this in mind, we ask you not to use the raise hand option, but to type your questions into the chat box. Similarly, on our Facebook Live platform, please use the comments section to post your questions, and they will be addressed via that platform, or some of the questions will be forwarded to our presenters for their response. Okay, but feel free for Zoom participants as well as our Facebook Live participants to use the thumbs up icon or the clapping hand icon if there is something that you are pleased about or interested in. Nearing the end of that discussion segment, we'll also be launching a very short poll, and this is basically an evaluation of the session, about 4 questions to get your feedback. And this is important to us as we improve the webinars moving forward. Okay, so once the poll comes up, it will be up for about 3 minutes, and we encourage everyone to complete it. I will provide a prompt before it is launched. So with that in mind, I am pleased to introduce our presenters today. We have 2 very experienced officers from the EMA's Permit Monitoring and Complaints Department. The first presenter will be Cherise Brathwaite-Joseph, and she is a regional coordinator attached to that unit. And we also have Shanta Ramnath, who is an environmental investigator too. And so without any further delay, we will begin today's presentation. And I now hand over to Cherise.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar entitled Permit Monitoring, the Next Steps After a Permit Has Been Issued. As Nadia would have indicated, my name is Cherise Brathwaite-Joseph. I am a regional coordinator of the Permit Monitoring and Complaints Unit at the Environmental Management Authority. I will be joined by Shanta Ramnath. She's an environmental investigator too at the EMA, and we'll be conducting today's session. So in this session, we're going to briefly be discussing what permit monitoring at the EMA entails. We will briefly discuss what is permit monitoring, why does the EMA monitor permits, and also how does the EMA monitor permits. For the purpose of today's presentation, and in the interest of time, we will be focusing on the certificates of environmental clearance. However, the EMA does issue different types of permits that are monitored in similar fashions. In this presentation, we will be discussing also what permit holders, and especially CEC holders, can generally expect to happen once a permit has been issued. So to begin, what do we mean by permit monitoring? Permit monitoring is one of the ways by which the EMA ensures that persons who are issued a permit understand and comply with the terms and conditions that have been agreed to within that permit. We verify that permit holders adhere to the mitigation measures that may be identified and have been assessed and approved by the EMA throughout the life cycle of the project. Permits issued by the EMA are all considered to be legally binding contracts between the EMA and the permit holder. However, permits are not a blanket approval to conduct an activity freely, but they are considered to be conditional approvals. All parties must adhere to the conditions described within the permits, as well as what was assessed during the application stage. All representations made during a CEC application stage or permit application stage are also responsibility of the permit holder. Through the monitoring of the permits, we strive to facilitate compliance with all the requirements of the legislation, and in particular, if there have been any environmental impacts that have been identified or observed, we ensure that corrective actions are put in place in a timely fashion. So why does the EMA monitor permits? The EMA undertakes the monitoring of permits as guided by legislation. The Environmental Management Act, in particular Chapter 3505, states, as you can see on the screen now, that the EMA must monitor the performance of the activity for which a permit has been issued to ensure compliance with any conditions within the Certificate of Environmental Clearance and to ensure that the activity progresses in a manner consistent with the description within the CEC application. Additionally, Section 62 of the Act outlines 11 environmental requirements which make it incumbent on a person to comply with, for example, procedures and standards with respect to permits or licenses. Within the EMA, the monitoring of permits is done by the Permit Monitoring and Complaints Unit, which we call PMC, and the unit was established to ensure that the above rule, as outlined by the EM Act, is fulfilled. So when we speak about permits, what kind of permits are we speaking about? There are three major types of environmental permits that are currently issued by the EMA. Certificates of Environmental Clearance, which are known as CECs, are by far the most known type of permit that the EMA issues. And as I mentioned earlier, they will be the focus of the presentation today. But the EMA also issues water pollution permits, air pollution permits, and we do these to regulate those types of emissions. The EMA also issues noise variations, which are monitored by the Environmental Police Unit, and the results of that monitoring is assessed by officers within the EMA. We are going to be discussing CECs, but please note that the steps that we take to facilitate compliance with the CECs are all used to monitor the permits by the EMA, including the water pollution permits and the air pollution permits. So to the focus of our presentation as to what exactly is a certificate of environmental clearance. As was mentioned earlier, the last webinar would have gone through the process of applying for a CEC and when a CEC is required. But for a brief recap for those joining us, CEC stands for Certificate of Environmental Clearance. It's the oldest type of permit issued by the EMA, and it is the most frequently issued. It was first issued in 2001, and since then we have received over 6,000 CEC applications. A CEC certifies that the EMA has looked at the activity, assessed all possible impacts on human health and environment, assessed the proposed mitigation measures that will be put in place, and the EMA has found that the project is acceptable once these pre-approved conditions are adhered to. CEC conditions describe the steps that permit holders need to take to ensure that their projects are compliant with the EMA's requirements. The CEC Designated Activities Order of 2001 specifies 44 designated activities that have been identified as having sufficient enough environmental impact that they require this prior assessment and approval from the EMA before proceeding. If you'd like any further information on these activities, the list of designated activities can be found on EMA's website. So what happens after the EMA determines that a project needs to be issued a CEC? So once a CEC is issued, it is assigned to a monitoring officer within the Permit Monitoring and Complaints Unit. This officer will review the project, assess the status of the project, assess the content of the file, review the intended start date, any key timelines for the project, and prioritize that file accordingly. Monitoring officers of the PMC unit use a combination of regular meetings with permit holders, the conduct of site visit investigations, and the review and analysis of any required submissions, including pollution monitoring reports. And we do these to effectively monitor all the conditions of the permits. At this point, I will hand over to Shanta, who is going to discuss more about what exactly these different steps in monitoring entails.
Thank you very much, Sharice, and good afternoon, everyone. So the first aspect of monitoring is our contact meeting. So once a CEC has been issued, a meeting will be set up between the EMA, more specifically the monitoring officer, and the permit holder to discuss the conditions of the CEC and to clarify any issues that may arise. So this is a contact meeting, and it is held to ensure that everyone is on the same page regarding the expectations and what is required at every stage of the project. In particular, the conditions of the CEC that will be reviewed and clarified, and the timeline set out in the CEC for the conduct of certain activities and the submission of key reports will be discussed. At this contact meeting, a generalized schedule for the conduct of site visits will also be discussed. Follow-up meetings with the permit holders may be held to discuss any new developments, changes, or challenges or complaints that we receive from a CEC. The second stage of the CEC is site visits. Monitoring officers conduct site visits, regular site visits to assess the compliance of the CEC. Sorry, we do apologize for that. The frequency of the site visit is based on the stage of activity that is currently happening. Example, pre-construction, construction, operations, etc. These regular site visits allow the officers to witness what's happening on the ground, document any observations that may indicate non-compliance with the CEC conditions, and provide immediate guidance to permit holders. During the site visit, the monitoring officer will assess the on-site conditions and audit against the conditions of the CEC. At the site visit, GPS points and other measurements will be taken at various points of interest, as well as notes from on-site interviews. Some conditions of the CEC prescribe the installation of mitigation measures on the site. So when a site visit is conducted, we observe the presence of these measures and if they are installed and working properly as guided by industry's best practice or international guidelines. Examples of some of these measures include the installation of a wash bay, sediment retention measures, and the proper storage of aggregates. The EMA also participates in joint site visits to address any concerns that are brought to our attention through other agencies. The third aspect of monitoring includes the review of documents. So all CECs require the submission of certain documents to the EMA. At a minimum, permit holders are required to submit the finalized scope of works for the project, a schedule of activities to be conducted, and to notify the EMA when works are expected to commence on the site. Permit holders must also provide the name and contact information of a designated liaison officer and a designated community relations officer. So as CECs are assessed and issued on a case-by-case basis, some CECs require specific detailed plans to be submitted for review and approval by the EMA prior to works commencing on the site. Some examples of such plans are quality assurance project plan, monitoring reports, rehabilitation plans. There is also a responsibility on the permit holder's part to be cognizant of these requirements at all stages of the project and the timelines for submission of documents. CECs also allow for some modification to the permit conditions, as it is understood that these activities are dynamic in nature. However, these modifications must be communicated to the EMA for assessment and approval before proceeding. Any modification approved must not introduce any new designated activities or create any significant increase in pollution loads or introduce any new environmental impacts that would not have been originally assessed. So through the monitoring of the CECs, the monitoring officer may be made aware of potential non-compliance to the conditions held within the CEC. And once this happens, we take corrective action. So we take these actions to bring the CEC holder into compliance with the CEC as quickly as possible. So if there's evidence of non-compliance with the CEC, the EMA will instruct the CEC holder both verbally and through official communication to correct the non-compliances within a stipulated time frame. If an extension of the deadline is needed, the CEC holder must provide sound justification for the extension request and indicate a new time frame for implementation. So once these measures are implemented, the EMA will conduct site visits to verify the implementation of said measures. If, however, the CEC holder has made insufficient attempts to address the observed non-compliances, or the observed non-compliances have severe environmental impacts, the relevant evidence is compiled as a request for enforcement and referred to the EMA's Legal Services Department. Legal Services will review the evidence provided in the request for enforcement as well as the conditions of the CEC and determine whether a breach of an environmental regulation has occurred. If so, a notice of violation will be issued, which would outline the legal infractions and provide another opportunity to correct. So in addition, through our site visit monitoring, we are made aware of potential non-compliance with the CEC through complaints from stakeholders. These complaints serve to inform the EMA of impacts being experienced or to bring to the attention potential non-compliances. So in this way, complaints can be used as an indicator of non-compliance and may suggest that the permit holder is not adhering to the conditions of the CEC. For example, persons living nearby to a construction site may complain of excessively muddy roads, and this may indicate that there is no wash bay installed, which may be required by the CEC. So while a complaint may potentially indicate non-compliance with the CEC, the EMA must investigate and assess the situation. So at times, the EMA receives complaints and the CEC may not regulate the impact that is being experienced. In such an instance, the monitoring officer will coordinate with the relevant agencies and authorities to address the concerns. Another example, persons living adjacent to a watercourse expressing concerns about the erosion of the bank of the watercourse due to runoff from a nearby construction site. In this example, the EMA will liaise with the relevant agency, which is the Drainage Division, to assess the situation and provide the necessary recommendations or guidance to the CEC holder. As was mentioned earlier, CEC holders are required to provide the EMA with the name and contact information for a community relations officer. This person is responsible for liaising with the community and interested stakeholders. So aside from informing the EMA, the condition in the CEC states that all stakeholders must be notified of the community relations officer's contact information and name prior to the commencement of works on site. So in addition to triggering an EMA's investigation, complainants can also direct their concerns or issues to the designated community relations officer to have their complaints addressed in a timely manner. The EMA will also communicate directly with the community relations officer to ensure that the complaints have been recorded and there have been prompt investigation on the part of the CEC holder. So at this time, I will now hand you back to Cherise, who will answer some more common, frequently asked questions about permit monitoring.
Thank you, Chantal. So now that we've gone through what permit monitoring actually entails, let's answer some frequently asked questions that we often hear from the public as well as permit holders. So the first question, does a certificate of environmental clearance now mean that I can now proceed with my activity? No. A CEC does not permit you to proceed with works on its own. The CEC does not absolve you from obtaining other relevant planning and development permissions. And additionally, from a monitoring perspective, as we noted, there are conditions included in the CEC which require that submissions be made to the EMA prior to the commencement of works. Some of these require approvals before works can begin. If you have received a CEC, please be sure to read it very carefully, and after the CEC is issued, you'll be called in for a contact meeting with your officer where the conditions of the CEC can be discussed and any misunderstandings clarified. So question, will the EMA be visiting my facility regularly? Yes, after a CEC is issued and the status of the activity is obtained and assessed, dependent on the nature, the scale, and the duration of the activity, it may be necessary to conduct site visits frequently to monitor all aspects of the project against the measures dictated by the CEC, and to ensure that these measures are being implemented effectively. The frequency of these visits will be determined on a case-by-case basis. And of note, in light of the national situation with regards to COVID-19, the conduct of site visits has been limited. However, there are conditions within the CEC that allow officers of the EMA to request evidence of on-site measures being put in place and that monitoring has been conducted. Monitoring officers have been working with CEC holders to determine the best course of action during this time. So, do permits expire? Yes, permits currently issued by the EMA do cease to have validity after certain prescribed periods of time. For example, all CECs shall cease to have any validity, force, or effect if the activity for which a certificate has been issued does not commence within 3 years of the issue date of the CEC. However, once the CEC has been issued and the works have commenced, that CEC is valid for the life of the project. After the 3-year period, if there's an intention to continue those works, a new application will have to be submitted. Similarly, water pollution permits and air pollution permits are issued for no longer than 5 years. I received a CEC, but since it has been issued, the activity has changed. What is the next step? So any change to the design, layout, scope of works of the activity, location must be communicated to the EMA for review and approval through a formal request for modification prior to the commencement of any works related to that activity. Significant modifications or changes to the original scope of works, the nature, the scale, and location of that project would require a new CEC application to be submitted and assessed. Also, please note that other relevant regulatory agencies may also require their own notification and approvals as well. How should I send required submissions in the EMA? As we described before, the CECs do contain a lot of submissions that need to be submitted for review. So the permits, including the CECs and the water pollution permits, do provide guidance within the body of the permit as to how submissions are to be made under that permit to the EMA. In general, all CECs and permit-related correspondence require submission in electronic copy as well as hard copy to the address identified in the permit. Again, in light of the national situation with regards to COVID-19 and the directives for social distancing, please note that we are primarily accepting electronic submissions, the details of which can be found on the website, and hard copies can be dropped off at physical drop boxes that have been established at the EMA's Port of Spain office at number 8 Elizabeth Street, St. Clair, and our San Fernando office in Duncan Village, San Fernando. I've made a complaint and I was told the activity has a CEC and is being investigated. What do I do now? When a complaint is made, it's logged in our complaints database, and during the stages of our investigation, this database is updated and those updates are made available through the EMA hotline. If the impact is being experienced and does not fall under the remit of the EMA and may be regulated by another agency such as the Regional Corporation, Ministry of Health, Town and Country Planning, the EMA will investigate and liaise with the different agencies and coordinate as necessary. Additionally, as Shanta would have indicated, any complaint should also be directed to the designated community relations officer of the activity. If you require information on who that community relations officer is, that can be provided through hotline as well. So any further information, as I said, can be obtained from EMA's website, which is www.ema.co.tt. And if there are any further questions, please feel free to email emawebinars@ema.co.tt. I'll now hand back to Nadia, who will lead us through the question and answer discussion.
Okay, thank you both Sharice and Shanta for giving us that very insightful presentation into the EMA's permit monitoring process. So at this point, I will remind our viewers that we will welcome their questions via the chat option. So please type your questions into the chat box so that we can provide responses to those questions. Also, if by chance during the question and answer segment, we are unable to respond to your question, please feel free to use our EMA email, which is emawebinars@ema.co.tt, emawebinars@ema.co.tt to provide those questions, and we will try to respond to them in the shortest possible time frame. Okay. So while we await the questions, I see we have one coming in, so we'll go straight to it. Now it started to rain, so in case, Sharice, I would read the question twice so that you'll be able to hear it. Do you believe that the EMA has sufficient resources to carry out effective compliance monitoring? I will repeat. Do you believe that the EMA has sufficient resources to carry out effective compliance monitoring?
Right. So to answer that question, the EMA, we remain limited with our resources, and we do work within the constraints. In particular, for permit monitoring, as I said, the officers do prioritize their files dependent on the severity of the issues being experienced, as well as the receptors that may also be experiencing the impact. However, as more and more permits are issued, as I said, we have over 6,000 applications, and there are more CECs that are available, issued every day. As much as we apply resources as effectively as we can now, that we will need to reassess and redeploy resources as necessary in future.
Okay, thank you, Sharice. So we'll go to another question. SDS sheets. Do you have templates for exactly how these should be done? I'll repeat, SDS sheets. Do you have templates for how these should be done?
Okay, so SDS sheets are safety data sheets. Now, we don't have templates for how a safety data sheet is done. Once you purchase a particular solvent or chemical, they come with specific safety data sheets. So these are what we require when we ask for your safety data sheets. So it's a standardized list, it's a standardized document that comes with your chemical purchase or with your solvent purchase.
So let me just apologize for the quality of the audio from Shanta. We seem to be having some issues there. So what I will do, I will redirect the same question to Sharice. So Sharice, we will ask you to respond to the questions from here onwards so that we can rectify the issue with Shanta. So I will repeat the question that she just responded to for the benefit of the viewing audience. Okay, so SDS sheets. Do you have templates for exactly how these should be done? Sharice.
Right. So what Shanta would have indicated in her response, which most people did not hear, is that the chemicals and solvents that require SDS, which are safety data sheets, would have that information. The chemicals and solvents that are used would be accompanied by these sheets. Those are the sheets, and they're already in a template that we would accept.
Okay, thank you, Sharice. We'll move to the next question, and Sharice, I'll ask you to respond to this question. If the scope of work has not changed, but the means and methods have changed, do we need to modify the CEC? If the scope of work has not changed, but the means and methods have changed, do we need to modify the CEC?
So a request for modification that we speak of would be if there's been a change in, as I said, the nature, the scale, the layout, the location of the project, anything that may introduce new environmental impacts that may be unmitigated by mitigation measures that are already identified within the CEC. Without any further details from that question, if the end activity remains the same, and if the scope of works has remained exactly the same, there would be no reintroduced or newly introduced environmental impacts. If it's just the methods, that would not really constitute a request for modification. However, we would ask that you liaise with the monitoring officer to ensure that we are kept informed as to what is happening on the site, who are the contractors, what we can expect in that situation. But from the question, it doesn't appear that there would be any introduced environmental impacts just from changing the method of which the work is done.
Okay, thank you, Sharice, for providing clarification with respect to that question. So what mechanisms do the EMA utilize to protect its monitoring staff during site visits, especially at hostile sites? So what mechanisms does the EMA utilize to protect its monitoring staff during site visits, especially at hostile sites?
So, as we mentioned before, the officers do conduct site visits, and the question is correct that there are some situations where they would be particularly sensitive situations. There would be hostile persons, it may be a hostile environment, it may be a particularly sensitive situation, especially when it comes to investigating complaints. In a situation like that, what the EMA can do if an officer does suspect that they would be exposed to a particularly sensitive or vulnerable situation, we do have access to the use of the environmental police unit to accompany us on our site visits, which allows a level of protection for the officers so that we do have police protection on the accompaniment of the sites, to the sites.
Okay, thanks, Sharice, for highlighting the role of the environmental police unit in that respect. So we'll move to the next question. What does the permit monitoring and complaints unit do when residents are being affected by an activity issued by a CC and the residents are not getting through with the community liaison officer of the permit holder? I'll repeat. What does the permit monitoring and complaints unit do when residents are being affected by an activity issued by a CC and the residents are not getting through with the community liaison officer of the permit holder?
So if a resident is being affected by any activity that has a CC issue and they're not getting through to the community liaison officer, they are free to call the EMA, and the main menu of the EMA will send you straight to the hotline. You can go to the hotline and lodge an official complaint. Please, when you're doing so, leave your name and contact information where we can get you at, so we can have a better description of the site, of the location, and please be very clear on what the complaint is, what the concern is.
Right. I will add to that because we are experiencing the audio issue again. What Chantal was saying was if the public or a complainant is not having a lot of luck in getting the contact information of the community relations officer, or they feel like they are unheard, as we would have mentioned in the presentation earlier, the EMA also conducts its own investigation alongside liaising with the community relations officer. As such, what we would do is we would ensure that all the complaints and the details of the complaints that we have also received are relayed directly to the community relations officer. And if they're not, if there's no response, we would be continuing our investigation to see if the impacts have been felt over time, if the impacts have been unmitigated, and then we would follow the same protocols of if an impact has continued to be experienced without the mitigation measures as dictated by the CEC or by a permit, then we would proceed to compile that evidence and our observations and transfer it over to our legal services department through a request for enforcement if the impact.
Okay, thank you both, Sharice and Shanta. So Sharice, it looks like you'll be on your own from here onwards because we seem to be having a reoccurring problem with Shanta. So we want to thank Shanta for her contributions thus far. Okay, so let's move to the next question. What is the process for requesting a modification to the CC? For example, a parameter being monitored under a permit has shown over the years to be in compliance or below detectable limits. So what is the process for requesting a modification to the CC? For example, a parameter being monitored under a permit has shown over the years to be in compliance or below detectable limits.
So many of the CECs do contain a condition that if there is an observation of continued general compliance, especially with certain parameters, that the permit holder would reserve the right to request a review of the monitoring regime by the EMA. If the CEC, because CECs, and that's what this person is speaking about, if that CEC is done by a case-by-case basis and it does not contain that condition, we would still acknowledge that there would be general compliance and we would request that when that modification is requested for our assessment, that we would be provided with all the necessary data to ensure that there really has been a certain period of compliance with that parameter level. In the past, we have asked for historical data to indicate that testing has been done continuously and regularly, and it has shown continued compliance with the parameters outlined by the CEC or by part of our subsidiary legislation. And as in addition to that, we do have our ways of verifying that information that we can use to ensure that what has been provided to us is accurate, and we will work with the permit holder towards a regime that is more adapted to the current situation.
Okay, understood. Thank you, Sharice. We move to another question. What does a citizen do? It's actually two questions from this viewer. What does a citizen do in reporting illegal activities in areas that are sensitive and protected? So that's the first part of the question. Further to that question, without permission, including the CC. Okay, so what does a citizen do in reporting illegal activities in areas that are sensitive and protected? And further to that, without permission, including CC.
Right. So I can only answer from the EMA perspective, as the person would have indicated it is an illegal activity. So I am not sure if there would be a level of police involvement as well. But from an EMA's perspective, if what you're speaking of has no permissions from the EMA, what we would request is that you would notify us of the activity through our hotline, and it would be transferred to our emergency and response and investigations unit, who would do the investigation to see what permits should be in place, if they're not in place, if they are in place, and then either refer for further investigation or refer for enforcement internally.
Okay, so thank you, Sharice. So we will try again with Shanta when the opportunity arises, Sharice. So let me provide the next question. Are dispersion models available for major industrial sites? For example, Point Lisas. And is active monitoring conducted downwind, downstream based on these models? Is this data available for public perusal? Yeah, so it's more than one question. I will repeat. Are dispersion models available for major industrial sites, for example, Point Lisas? And is active monitoring conducted downwind, downstream based on these models? Is this data available for public perusal?
Okay, so sorry, it was a very long question, so I'll try to answer the first part. If dispersion modeling is done as part of the CEC requirements, we have requested that certain permit holders would do air dispersion modeling, which I think the person is speaking about, to indicate where, if there is an emission being made from that site, where would be the most sensitive receptors, which direction would be experiencing that impact the most. So dispersion modeling has been done for CEC holders. I can't speak to the estate on a whole that the person is speaking about, because that would be made up of different CEC holders. But to answer the second question, if that dispersion modeling is made available, those dispersion models would form part of a CEC application. All the CEC applications and relevant data are housed in our library, in the National Library, which can be accessed by the public through appointment, as well as any further information can be accessed through a Freedom of Information Act request for the data that you are seeking, the relevant data. I think there was one more part about downwind. I don't know if you can repeat. Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so the second part has to do with, and is active monitoring conducted downwind? I believe you would have attempted to respond to that based on these models. Is this data available for public perusal?
Right, so to clarify where the data sample, where the monitoring points are located, as the modeling would be done as part of the CEC application, sample points and points for monitoring that the EMA requires would be based on this modeling on where the sensitive receptors and most impact would have been indicated. So yes.
All right, thank you for that response. And maybe for the next question, you or Shanta can attempt it. what are the kinds of penalties that the EMA uses when there is non-compliance on the part of the permit holders? So what are the kinds of penalties that the EMA uses when there is non-compliance on the part of permit holders?
So when we observe non-compliances on site, as Shanta would have indicated, the first course of action, because it is more immediate, is that we would instruct the permit holder to put in corrective actions. If we do not see a remediation of these impacts being felt, the person is asking what type of enforcement can we take. So we would simply compile the observations and the evidence towards the legal department. The legal department can choose the course of action to be taken. It can include consent agreements, which is an agreement between the violator as well as the EMA that things will be put in place or things will be applied for to regulate the activity. It can result in fines that have been done in the past, or it can be escalated to further legal action, which I'm sure we will speak about when the Legal Services Department is able to have a webinar.
Okay, thank you, Sharice. And if we have an approved CC that does not address an activity that is done in our normal course of business, would it need to be modified? So I will repeat it. If we have an approved CC that does not address an activity that is done in our normal course of business, would it need to be modified?
This question in particular, I think we may need some more details about the case. As such, I would request that that question be deferred to EMA webinars at ema.co.tt, because without knowing the specifics of that situation, I don't think we would be in a place to properly advise if a modification would be necessary or if a new CC application would be necessary. So I would kindly ask that that question be sent to EMA webinars at ema.co.tt for some further guidance.
Okay, no problem. Thank you so much for your response. So the next question, how does one get in touch with the officer assigned to the particular business after the CC was issued? All right. So there's a statement which follows, I'm unsure as to whether it was stated. Also, can I have some clarification if a business was already operational, and how soon are we able to get in contact with the officer? So I'll repeat. How does one get in touch with the officer assigned to the particular business after the CC was issued?
I'm not entirely clear if we're talking about getting in contact with the officer of the EMA or the designated officer of the permit holder. However, I will answer both. So when a CEC is issued, as I said, it would be transferred over to a monitoring officer. As part of the protocols, the monitoring officer would make contact with the permit holder to indicate that the file is now being actively monitored, assess the status of the file and the project, etc. If the person is speaking about trying to obtain information about the designated liaison officer from the permit holder's perspective as to who they're supposed to be speaking to, that information is supposed to be provided to the EMA. So you can also liaise with the EMA to get that information, as well as part of the CEC requirements, permit holders are supposed to notify all stakeholders of the designated persons, contact persons, before the commencement of the activity throughout the community, etc. So that's a bit of a two-pronged question, and hopefully I answered both.
Okay, thank you, Sharice. So I'll direct the next question to Shanta. Okay, so how does the EMA verify or validate monitoring data that is submitted as part of the permit monitoring process? Shanta, would you like me to repeat?
Sure.
Okay, so how does the EMA validate the monitoring data that is submitted as part of the permit monitoring process?
Okay, so once a CC is issued, and if you have any monitoring conditions, first the CC will ask you to submit a quality assurance project plan. So in the quality assurance project plan, it will outline exactly where the samples are taken, how the samples are taken, and it will have the quality assurance, quality control measures for the service provider that's doing the sampling. So the EMA will review and approve the quality assurance project plan. So this is one method that we use to verify or to validate the results that we get. Another method is if we continue to have further discrepancies in the data that we receive, we have other methods that we use to verify, one of which could be third-party verification.
Okay, thank you, Shanta. So at this point, we will launch the poll, for those of you who would have joined after I mentioned poll in the introduction, it's just a very short session evaluation, just 4 questions to get your feedback on today's webinar. So it should come up, it's in front of the screen now, and we encourage everyone to complete it. So while that is being done, I will read the next question. So Shanta, what percentage of compliance is being achieved at this time? What percentage of compliance is being achieved at this time? Because you know, Sharice mentioned that the EMA would have issued thousands of CCs already, right? So we look forward to getting your response here.
Okay, well, to answer the question, we don't have the particular statistics on what percentage of compliance is achieved, because compliance is something that is dynamic. So for instance, at one stage of the activity, say construction stage, the permit holder may be in compliance with the construction conditions of the CEC, while at the operational stage where they need to submit water quality monitoring reports, they may be out of compliance. So it's very difficult to determine what percentage of compliance each permit holder what percentage compliance we achieve for CCs.
I would also just like to, I wanted to add, if any information would be required about the certain compliance level of a particular file, a particular company, that information can be requested. We will work with the person to give that information. However, as Shanta said, it is a very dynamic process. It's not an absolute percentage. So that information can be given through liaising with the officers.
Okay, and we have spoken a lot about the permit holders being responsible to provide reports, and the different types of reports that you all stated in the presentation. But how would a person go about accessing these reports?
Okay, so once there is a submission under a CEC, all the documents will be lodged at the EMA's library. So anyone can access those reports to review it and to look at what information is in the report. You can always call the EMA's number and make an appointment to view a particular file at the library. It is there and it is accessible.
Okay, and just to add to what Shanta mentioned, owing to the COVID-19 restrictions, the EMA's offices are closed to the public, but requests to the library can be sent via email, information@ema.co.tt. Okay, so I'll repeat, information@ema.co.tt. So we have another question. Does the EMA revoke permits? It's a nice short question. Does the EMA revoke permits?
As monitoring officers, we would not be able to speak to if the EMA has revoked permits in the past or plans to revoke permits. However, that question can be sent to our legal department and they'll be able to give a better answer as to the status of any permit revocation.
Okay, thank you, Sharice. Another question. If we have an approved CEC and we have a new activity that has no environmental impact, would the CC need to be modified? I'll repeat. If we have an approved CC and we have a new activity that has no environmental impact, would the CC need to be modified?
Okay, so once a CC is issued, it is issued for a specific activity at a particular location. So once there's any change to the activity or change to the location, CC holders must submit to the EMA these changes, and the EMA will review the changes and determine if a modification is required. If a modification is required, or if the activity introduces a new designated activity, a new CC will need to be issued. If it does not, the EMA will review and either approve or ask the permit holder to submit for a new CC.
Okay, thank you, Chantal. So I will ask, this will be our final question today as we near the end of this afternoon's presentation. Let's say the residents are being affected by an activity that has a CEC, and they are unable to get in contact with the community liaison officer. How does the EMA assist or address that?
So if the residents are unable to contact the community liaison officer, like I said previously, they can call the EMA and launch a complaint against the activity. So once they launch a complaint, the hotline, they will contact the monitoring officer for the CEC file, and we will be in contact with the complainant to discuss what the concerns are. We will also conduct site visits to look at what the issues are and discuss with the CC holder how it can best be rectified.
Okay, so thank you very much, Chantal and Charisse, for giving us such an insightful presentation into the EMA's permit monitoring process. I just want to remind our viewers that we encourage you to join us on the 6th of October for our next webinar, where we will be addressing the revised water pollution rules. Some of you may know or may not that these rules were in effect for a number of years, and it did undergo a revision process, and it was implemented in 2019. So this would be your opportunity to get more information on the revised rules. Also, the EMA's nomination period for the Greenleaf Awards ends on September 30th. So we are reminding everyone that if you are still interested in submitting proposals, or a friend or someone you know, you still have some time to compile that data and send it in, okay? So thanks again for viewing today, and remember to stay safe and please wear a mask.